as something else. One of I'm just showing you some of the most famous canonical images of the breakdown of the ethics and rules of war in a civil war context. Now, the context of the American Civil War, the Andersonville prison camp in the South, where many people died, and whose commander was the only person tried for a war crime in the American Civil War, the Southern commander of this war camp, was still a place where they gave soldiers rations. They at least, in principle, said, we're treating these people as human beings. Badly administered, bad climate, but still within the realm of the human, of these rules that we've been talking about. And the soldiers, for example, who did die, they were identified, and they're buried now in these orderly rows. I mean, order is brought out of this death. Now, again, in the context when this breaks down or when something else happens in the war, to shift it out of this war between belligerents, these rules of wars become more problematic. Now, this is Sherman's burning. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of this. This is sort of within the rules of war. General Sherman, an important Northern general, burns a train station. It's fine to burn train stations. It's fine to break up railway tracks, because that's part of the rules of war. What's not fine is to burn people's houses. Right? So there's this distinction, and this was made in the Civil War, between the act of war on the one hand, the digging up the tracks, and the burning of civilian property. The next version, in the American Civil War, the next version of this is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, in which another Northern general, General Sheridan, famously said that he was going to make large swaths of the Shenandoah Valley so bare that even a crow flying over would not find a grain of corn to eat. Why did he do this? Early in the war, he was scrupulous. If he used a rail from someone's fence for firewood, he paid for it. We have the account books of this army. Every civilian right was met. Then he was being attacked by a group of Southern guerrilla fighters who were living off the countryside. And he began a scorched earth policy and killed large numbers, not so many large numbers of people, but a very considerable number of animals. 10,000 cattle, burned 1,200 barns, 4,000 horses, and 500,000 bushels of grain. So basically a kind of a reversion to a war of destruction rather than with no against the civilian population, on the claim that the civilian military distinction had broken down. The Spanish Civil War is another great example of this, and is the first one of, in some sense, sort of modern wars in this sense. It was a war between the fascist force of Generalissimo Franco and the nationalist and the elected Republican government. Anti-clericalism played a huge part in this. Here you see Republican soldiers shooting at a statue of the Virgin. Culturally equally resonant attacks were made on the other side. It was a war after which, sorry, I want to show this is the Yugoslavia. I'll show you the picture in just a second. Civilian bombing became an important sort of feature, and for the first time in a war, the death toll of civilians, this case almost exceeded actually the death toll of combatants. So to give you a sense of this, in the First World War, about 15% of people who died were civilians. In the Second World War, about slightly more than half of the people who died were civilians. In the Spanish Civil War, about 60% of the people who died were civilians. So there's a breakdown in these civil wars of the civilian military distinction. And I want to show you this picture because it was not ideology as it was in the Spanish Civil War and in the French Revolutionary Wars. It's ethnic hatred. So here you see Muslim prisoners in a Serbian camp being starved. clear violation of these rules, and for which Milosevic was actually tried in the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. This was one of the offenses. So I've talked to you now about civil wars. I've talked about modern warfare where civilian-military distinctions break down. That's a big question in the world today, in cases in which a state fights what it takes to be irregular forces. And I have I have on BSpace, though it's not required, a really interesting debate between various Israeli scholars on the question of whether Israel, in particular, but this applies to any nation, owes the same protection to its own to the civilians of a foreign state, of someone else, as it does to its own. And Margalit, the people involved, make the following sort of case. They say, look, imagine this situation. Hezbollah captures a village, and all its members, Israeli citizens, are held as hostages. The Hezbollah fighters are mingling with the various kibbutz members and village members, and so therefore shielded from attack. Number two, Hezbollah captures the outside of this town, and a group of pro-Israeli non-combatant volunteers around there, not Israeli citizens, who are there, are captured and are used as human shields. Third, instead of these well-wishers, a group of American peace activists around this village. Hezbollah attacks, and they're kept as human shields. And fourth, all the people in the village flee. Hezbollah moves in with its own civilian supporters and takes over the village. Now, does the Israeli military have a different obligation in taking this village back in case one were the Israeli civilians, case two were the foreign pro-Israeli, case three were their foreign, quote, anti-peace activists, and case four where there's civilians of the enemy? And they want to argue, it's a very high military standard, they want to argue that the rule of war is that you protect all civilians equally. Now, this is not to say that you might not harm civilians as collateral damage in a military campaign, because clearly that happens in military situations for military aim. But the collateral damage has to be assessed from an ethical point of view, the same irrespective of who these civilians are. So what I'm suggesting to you is these debates about who counts as a civilian and what sort of civilian matters is absolutely at the core of a great deal of real political debate in the world today. And investigations of what exactly Israel did in particular cases is, as you know, international news, and likewise in other of these kind of irregular combatant situations. So I want to suggest to you then that this case of modern warfare raises all sorts of issues, but the principles that we talked about protecting civilians, some are more or less the same. And the question is, how stringent does one, this is a political question as well as an ethical question, can one be in maintaining these distinctions? So this picture of Guernica is a memorial in the Spanish Civil War to the bombing of the civilian population by the fascist forces, and the first great loss of civilian life in bombing. About 10,000 people died in this village, in this town, from aerial bombing. And that became, of course, the norm. When you all think of Second World War, you think of the German bombing of Hamburg. The German bombing of London and English cities, and of course the reciprocal bombing by the Americans and the Allied forces of Germany, which, as has been pointed out many times, you must have heard, it would have been counted as a war crime had the Allies lost. All right, so we talked about modern warfare where the civilian-military distinction has broken down, and we've talked about the question of the debate about whether what one owes to civilians of other countries. I want to get to another category now that we'll talk about more next time, and will come up in periodic in the future, there's a lot of irregular warfare now against just guerrillas, but also against people who fight in a different way. So one of the issues